Cylons were created by man. They rebelled. They evolved. They look and feel human. So we're programmed to think they are human. So say we all!
Hello and welcome to Galactica Actually. I am Jamie Smith and I've never been awake for 5 days straight. Joining me is my co-host Diallo Jackson. Have you ever been awake 5 days straight?
Never have I ever.
What's the longest length of time you've been awake?
Like maybe a couple days, maybe 3. I'm not sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
I honestly don't think I've ever been awake for 24 hours.
No?
Not really. Not completely awake. Like maybe I dozed, but no. Although that's not entirely true. I guess this trip I just recently took to England, I barely slept on the plane and then stayed awake the whole day and went to bed at like whatever time we went to bed, 10:30, 11 o'clock because we were tired. And that might have ended up being about 24 hours with the time difference. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I can barely handle, staying up past a certain time. So these guys had it rough in this episode for sure.
Yes. First of all, I just want to go over a little bit of show business. Our first episode is posted on the interwebs, so you should be able to find it on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts from, your whatever podcatcher you use. I also started a Twitter account, which is at galacticaactuallypod, which I know is clunky, but you only get a certain number of letters to use for those handles. I will, at the very least, tweet when a new episode goes up, but I'm not very good at Twitter. I guess that doesn't mean I can't get better, but I'm human. I'm not a Cylon. If I were a Cylon, I'd probably do better at Twitter.
Definitely takes bots to get those things going sometimes. So.
Yeah. I'm thinking about doing an Instagram because everybody uses Instagram so much, but I just don't really know what I would post. So we'll think about it. I love feedback and, your feedback, especially because you're the co-host.
I could work something up. We could do like an image a week from the episode and maybe the title and that kind of stuff. So, people know what to expect when they jump onto the podcast.
Okay.
We'll talk about it.
Sure. So let's get into this week's episode. I thought about being like, okay, we've got 33 minutes, but I feel like that would be a disservice.
Yeah. I mean, this episode was, longer than 33 minutes. So
yeah. So this was the first episode of the actual season. Did you want to say who wrote and directed and all of that?
Yeah, it kicked off the series. The regular series is written by Ronald D. Moore, the showrunner and of again my favorite Star Trek show, Deep Space Nine, and the director Michael Reimer, who was responsible for the look and feel of the miniseries that carried over into the regular show. And he's probably the one of the principal, landmark directors of the show over the course of the series.
Yeah. We also get Bear McCreary, finally.
Yes, Bear McCreary doing his thing.
Some poundy drums.
Yeah. It's interesting because he took what was done by Richard Gibbs and just kind of like turned it to 11, it sounded like. So, yeah.
So we start out with the crew on the Galactica, and it seems everyone on Colonial 1. We could probably guess that the crews on the fleet ships as well have been up for 5 days straight, because every 33 minutes exactly the Cylons show up and try to kill them. Mm-hmm. We are dropping in on them just before their 237th jump. This just all just feels really exhausting. I have to commend them for making the decision to start the series out this way.
Yeah. I think Ron Moore said like he batted around a couple of ideas, but he pretty soon knew he was going to do 33, and then just like kind of jumped in and did it. I think he did it without really an outline or anything, which you can kind of feel the organicness of this episode from that. It's very experiential, like, and you get what they feel as they go through this exhausting experience.
Yeah, I read that he or maybe Michael Reimer, they gave each main character a different sort of like tick or thing that was affecting them the most in their exhaustion, so that everybody had a sort of different flavor to portray instead of everybody just sort of being the same.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I'd like to go back and rewatch and just sort of pick out like what was that thing for each character, because it's interesting. It just felt really real because everybody is going to deal with exhaustion in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, the first time, I remember the first viewing or the second one, it's just, the obvious one is the tired makeup. And that everyone's got beards and, saggy eyes and that kind of stuff. Their hair is out of place and unkempt. Not Rosalind, though. She's still all put together, but everybody else definitely looks worse for wear.
Her thing, I think, maybe was how she was speaking. Her voice was very soft and scratchy through the entire episode. And I noticed it, but I read this thing from Ron Moore or whoever afterwards. But hers, I think that might have been hers. I noticed, like, Adama had red eyes, like bloodshot eyes, which it almost looked watery, which I thought was a good effect. And that might have just been the makeup choice and not like a sort of acting choice,
Yeah.
I just noticed with him it was very noticeable. Might have been those contacts.
I don't even know how, like, especially this, I've watched this episode a billion times by now, but I don't know, I was really kind of contemplating the situation here. I literally don't know how they would have functioned. Like, there was never enough time to go to sleep. 130 hours of doing that. I don't, like, it's amazing that they made it 237 times.
It's amazing that apparently only 61 people had sort of broken down from exhaustion on the Galactica. I don't know how many people are on the Galactica, but 61 doesn't sound like nearly enough. People having like nervous breakdowns from exhaustion. Yeah.
Like, again, we can barely handle like a day, so it's pretty impressive. But I guess, there's also that sense of the adrenaline. They're like literally on the run, and like if they stop, they die. So there's that part that kept them going for sure.
Yeah, Ty says towards the end that he hasn't felt this alive in a really long time.
Yeah, totally. It's funny because, I read that a different way this time. But it's still
knowing what we know.
Yeah, knowing what we know. But I still think it's in the moment it was meant how it was taken on the surface, which is, he just like, oh man, I actually feel alive,
So there are 10 ships in the fleet that are having trouble with their jump drives. And one of them is Colonial 1. Rosalind says something to Billy about them cutting it a little close.
Yeah, they talk about having to reboot the nav computer or something like that.
Yeah. And, like, I'm sure everybody whoever it is that does the jump procedure is an expert by now after 5 days because, they hadn't really used their FTLs in a really long time. So now this is, like, old hat.
Yeah,
basically.
I guess it does explain how they go from the miniseries where, like you said, they hadn't even used them really to the rest of the series. It's just like, we're jumping. Pew, they're gone. Yeah.
So over on Colonial 1, we start off actually in Baltar's head back at his house on Caprica with Six. She eventually asks him about his faith in God, and he doesn't have any faith in God, and he says this thing about believing in things that are rational, and she says something and he's like, yeah, but you're not rational. And I like how, at least right now, he's just like almost dismissive of her until she like threatens him, which she does later, and it's debatable whether she's right that God has a plan for him and the whole Olympic carrier situation was a test, or if she just used that situation to get what she wanted out of him. What do you think?
Yeah, like when we get a little bit later down the line, the way they played the climax of the scene, I thought it was really interesting how there was an interplay on lots of different levels between how Baltar's objectives, her objectives, Rosalind's, Adama's, and then what the Cylons potentially. The way that I read her character now is actually separate from the Cylons. So, I know she is 6. She looks like the 6 model. But I'm starting, as I'm going through this time, I'm just kind of reading her as an sort of like an outside participant that is sort of almost like a spirit guide or something, that kind of concept. Because I don't think she's a Cylon. She's more of when she refers to God often, and then we know that final scene of the show. So I think she's just an angel, and she kind of she knows what's happening and what's going on, and she's kind of just playing around a little bit. That's just kind of how I'm reading it this time as I'm watching it.
Okay. Well, we'll track that, see if it all adds up.
Yeah. I don't think it all adds up. That's one of the complaints that people have about the show, but I actually, it's just my interpretation this time. I think she's just more of a spirit guide, and
she definitely knows stuff.
Yeah.
And she knows what the Cylons are up to an extent. Or at least what their maneuvers are. Which she would if she is a leftover from the actual 6 model that she was. I don't know, it's tricky because part of me is he's cracked. And she's just in his head, but it's not real. It's just the situation, his involvement in it, his place in it, and then being saved. It just cracked his brain. But then later, when we spend time with Caprica 6, and there's a Baltar in her head.
Yeah.
It's wait. I remember when we watched that episode, because that was back when I was still in LA. And I was watching it every week with our friend Sarah. And I just remember all of us being like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah.
Like, that was just so mind-blowing. So it's trying to figure out what exactly they are, and it never is explained.
Mm-hmm.
It's just she exists in his head, and then he exists in her head.
Yeah.
But
And then
she definitely knows stuff.
yeah, and again, my interpretation is just, and I think so. You know, when the finale happened, like, there's a lot of people that hate the finale. I don't, but
I don't.
I do remember good friend of mine. We had this debate, going back and forth, and it was around the time when Lost had its finale too, within a year or so, and we were kind of going back and forth about both of those. And he really hated the finale, and he had some valid points. I think whenever we get to season 4, I think he has some valid points. And when I rewatched it, I do see some things going on there, but I just, how to say it? His dissatisfaction shifted a few years later, because he said he had a very set way of thinking what life was about, and it was tied into a lack of accepting any kind of a spirituality, and that shifted for him over the course of a few years, and so he was able to accept some of these spiritual concepts that the show had, and not saying that he. It's like not saying that he became spiritual in real life, but he just kind of opened up to the idea that maybe this show was actually presenting that concept. And so he was a little bit softer. And when he did that, he was able to accept these things that I think people reject, like the Starbuck and the final scene with Head Baltar and Head Six. So I see it just as literally, this time around, sort of like semi-omnipotent observers that kind of, they're kind of manipulating a little bit here and there, a little bit like a trickster would do, like a little nudge here and there to get the players to act in certain ways, but not there to actually do anything in the scene. So... just kind of how I'm seeing it, but it could change as we move along, because I don't know exactly how that plugs in every scene as we go down the line. So it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
All right. So Adama has a plan to split the fleet into 6 smaller fleets, and then for them to meet up at a designated jump point 4 jumps from now, which seems unnecessarily complicated, and the kind of idea that someone would come up with when they haven't slept for 5 days.
You wanted to try something different. So
sure.
Yeah.
Like, I guess it would make their job on the Galactica easier at those 33-minute marks, because you wouldn't have to wait for all of these ships to get to safety. They would be at safety. However, knowing what we know, or kind of know, about the Olympic carrier, that would have been disastrous, because wherever the Olympic carrier went, the Cylons would go.
Yeah.
And then destroy whatever those ships were. So we meet Crashdown for the first time.
Yeah, that's what I wrote. Hey, Crashdown.
This is Kilo's replacement.
Yeah.
He is played by Sam Witwer, who... fans of Clone Wars and Rebels may recognize his name. He is the voice of Darth Maul. He is amazing as Darth Maul. And yet, when I found out it was him, I was like, ugh, that guy, because I kind of can't stand Crashdown.
Crashdown's kind of the worst, actually.
But now... because I have so much love for Sam Witwer because of Clone Wars and Rebels, I'm giving him a little bit of a chance this time around. Let's see if he makes me hate him again. But yeah, we've got Crashdown, who is not Hilo. Boomer is not happy about this situation. She calls him a refugee from Triton. I had to look it up. Triton is another ship.
Yeah.
And he's heard a rumor that the Marines left a man on Ragnar Station and that maybe the Cylons look like humans now. Which is, I mean, they should have known that there would be rumors when you publicly leave a person. Mm-hmm. Boomer, though, has no patience for him. I don't know if this is because if her Cylon programming is kicking in where he's talking about Cylons looking like people, so like she's just dismissive of it because she doesn't want to be caught subconsciously, or if it's because he's not Hilo and she's irritated that he's there and Hilo isn't, or if she's just her own guilt for leaving Hilo behind.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of those actually.
Yeah,
it's like it's very
or all three.
Yeah, it's very multi-layered for her. You could understand a bunch of those reasons. So yeah, and then Crashdown is like he's a little bit of like a straight arrow doofus. So he can't really read the room.
Yeah, I kind of always saw him as like douchey, like the jocks I went to high school with.
Well, it's...
Or like what I would now say is like mediocre white man syndrome. Where they're just so confident over nothing.
He definitely gets humanized a little bit later in the season, and
yeah.
And it just, like, as an actor, like, I remember, I think the next time I saw him, he was on Smallville, actually, for a whole season arc. And then he was in Being Human. And both of those roles for me, like, he was so, like kind of warm and sensitive. And so it's always funny to go back because every time I see Crashdown, it's like a kind of like a joke,
I mean, he, as an actor, made Darth Maul a character that you actually care about,
mm-hmm.
and that is all through his voice work.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't watch Being Human. I tried,
mm-hmm.
but I love the British original version,
mm-hmm.
and I watched the first episode of the Sci-Fi one, and I was like, "What the? I hate this. It's just not. It just was not right. It was not right. That none of these people were right. They weren't.
Yeah.
They weren't my people."
Yeah.
But I have heard that he's very good in it.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I love both. But the Sci-Fi version actually gets to continue where the BBC version has to kind of cut short. And I think they did a good job, but
maybe I'll give it another try now that I like Sam so much.
Yeah, I feel you on that though. It definitely.
He's no Aidan Turner.
Yeah, no, definitely not. Like that first season of BBC Being Human is just like, stellar. But the problem with the BBC show is like people leaving and blah blah, and they just kind of trails off.
Yeah,
and then it gets completely recast, right? At a certain point.
Yeah, because Aidan Turner left after season 3, and then the girl, I wish I could remember her name, the one who played the ghost, she left, and I think the werewolf stuck around.
Yeah, but then he dipped out. I think.
Thing.
He stuck around through the whole thing.
I think so. It's been a long time since I watched the final season, and this is not the Being Human podcast, but I did like where they went with the new characters. Maybe they did end up being all 3 new characters, but I don't know, there was just something really special about the first 3 seasons.
Yeah, no, they were great. They were really great. I love them.
So moving on to Dee, she is trying to find out if any of her family or friends have survived the attack on Sagittarion, but they don't have a complete list of survivors yet. So she's told to go put their picture on the wall. And what we see is that this entire hallway has been plastered with pictures of people's missing loved ones, which is very 9/11.
Yeah. I think
And
they end up
every
calling
Go
it
ahead.
the Wall of Remembrance, I think. Or the Hall of Remembrance. I think that's sort of like the unofficial name for it.
every time I see this, it like is so tied in with the images of those like boarded up rows of sidewalks in New York with people's pictures on them. It's just very effective. We find out that the current survivor count is 49,998 people, but that will soon change.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting about that because there was it 600 that they said went missing?
300.
Yeah, 300, yeah. And I found that whole sequence actually interesting because it was like, was there a miscount? But then they were like, well, there were some people that, died from wounds. And then in some of the reading that I was doing about the episode, there was like actually quite a bit that was cut out, maybe like 10 minutes or so that was cut. And some of it was like pretty dark stuff.
Yeah.
And one of them was that there were some of the crew, Galactica crew, unalived themselves, and I think that was that was deemed a little too dark.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but at
least for the first episode of the season.
Yeah, because we do see that happen later, but. Anyways, it just that the fact that they had that moment just adds to like even as we are they're trying to stay alive, there is this attrition that's happening despite their best efforts. So I just thought that was like a interesting scene to appear there.
The D scene?
Well, the scene
Or the
with
count.
with the count. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When they're talking about this is when Billy gets a message. I wanted to say text. It's not a text. It's a piece of paper with a note that there's a doctor who wants to come talk to Rosalind, that he's got urgent information regarding how the Cylons were able to orchestrate the attack. And in Baltar's head, Six is like, I knew that guy was onto us. With good reason. You were doing some shit. And so Baltar is panicking. It's this great moment where he's like trying to just act normal and can't because she's behind him talking. And after he leaves, Rosalind is like, well, he's a weird one.
Yeah. we see that quite a bit, especially in the first season. I love the interplay between him and them and how he is in real life and in his head. And
yeah. Later, there's some moments where I'm just like, how did they not think that he was absolutely out of his mind? But he hasn't shown any of that stuff yet.
There was a moment, this kind of, I kind of go back to, at the very beginning, blah, 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 blah. There are these models of Cylons, whatever, and they have a plan, right? And people towards the end of the show are complaining that there was no plan, but literally right here in this moment, Head 6 says, I want to have a child with you, Baltar.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And I just was, and we know where all of that stuff kind of goes. And I think that was the whole point of the show. Like, again, in the very first line of the miniseries, when she says, are you alive? That was a part of what their plan was. They're exploring what it means to be alive and if they can become like, if they can have recreate in a more organic, natural sense that humans do rather than the way that they have created themselves. So,
but aren't they surprised when Athena is pregnant?
Yeah, they are. But that was sort of, it was sort of like, I mean, we'll get into it a little bit more because that's like the Athena Hilo stuff is like it takes place the whole season. But I think that they were trying to understand what the nature of like love was and how that like how they could couple, like all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it sounds cheesy, but I think the missing ingredient for having a kid was love. You know, it's the fifth element. So yeah, I just think it was like a lot of it was like an exploration of the nature of being alive. And you know, if you go think back to like what we know much later with I don't know whether we would call it real Earth or fake Earth that the Cylons were on, but they had a civilization where they could just recreate like humans do, and I think that they were these younger versions of Cylons that didn't really know where they came from were trying to find their path along the same lines. So I just thought it was interesting that she said she wants a child in the first episode, and that's like literally where we end up heading down the road.
Yeah.
So
Baltar's face is hilarious when she's talking about that. Because he's just like, are you fucking kidding me? You are not even real. You are in my head. Like how? I think he actually says like, how would that happen?
Yeah. He's got commitment issues also.
Well, that too. But also, like, she physically doesn't exist.
Right.
So then there's this whole thing about Adama having Doc Coddle, who we haven't met yet, prescribe stims to the pilots because they are so exhausted. And they need to be able to do these shifts and not fall asleep in their cockpits.
We don't see... Do we not see Doc Coddle till the second season, or is it like later?
No,
in the first?
He's in the first season, but it's still a couple episodes away before we finally see him.
I just remember like because they kept saying Doc. We never got to see him, and
he's always on a different ship.
Yeah, I loved that actually. When we finally got to see the Doctor, he wasn't what I expected, and it was like, oh, but I love him. Love Doc Coddle.
So Lee tells Starbuck that she needs to take these stims, and she's like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. It makes my reaction time stalled and blah, blah, blah. And he just kind of lets it go. And she's like, no, you are my superior. I am your subordinate. And I am telling you I'm not going to do something. You should smack me in the mouth and force me to take them because you are the commanding officer. And he's like, you want me to hit you? And she's like, not really, but... And then they end up laughing. So it's like establishing that their relationship is a lot of like butting heads and then at the same time having fun with each other. Yeah.
The cornerstone of both iterations of Battlestar Galactica was the relationship between Starbuck and Apollo, and kind of setting the dynamic here. Obviously, you see how they interact. They both are very familiar with each other on a friend level, on a personal level, but then there's that layer of command. And so, and then, like you said, Starbucks, like, you know, she's always like pressing buttons, right? So she, in a good way, like, you know, it establishes also story-wise that like Starbuck has to take on the mantle of being in charge now, because I don't think he really wasn't in that position before.
You mean Apollo?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Apollo. So yeah, it serves like a lot of purposes, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, I can go on and on. Every scene, there's like 5 different things happening, and I just love how they set everything up. It's really, really fascinating and great.
She calls him out for his lackluster, like situation room meeting.
Yeah.
Too, where she's like, you don't say be safe out there. You say good hunting.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's just calling him out for, like, being kind of a weak leader and trying to push him to be a little more authoritative.
Yeah. She says, like, yeah, he's trying to be everybody's friend or something, and he's the CAG.
Yeah.
You're the CAG.
Yep. That was a lesson that I learned as a boss. Mm-hmm. The job I have now is the first time I've been a supervisor before, but I still had a direct boss.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I'm the manager, it's my authority. Like, it's my store, it's my authority. I have a boss, but my boss is not there every day. He's not there hardly ever. So, you know, I could not be friends with my staff. Mm-hmm. I will not be friends with my staff because it can undermine my authority. It can blur those lines. And when I was a supervisor, there were people that I had been friends with as a barista, and when I became a supervisor, they would just expect me to, like, give someone else that job. Mm-hmm. You're not gonna make me do it. Give it to that person. It's like, no, I asked you to do it. So yeah, that's an important lesson when you're in charge of other people. It's like, if you're gonna be friends with them, you also have to leave that at the door when you get to work.
Mm-hmm. And we have a little conversation a little bit later with Adama and Ty, kind of along those lines, where Ty basically, you know, says, yeah, I'm the ball buster. So that, and then, you know, Adama's like, yeah, so he can look good, you know? Mm-hmm. So you always have to, what does he say? If the XO, if you aren't mad at the XO, then you're not doing your job or something along those lines.
Right.
Yeah. So, but he gets to be the buffer for the captain who can actually, the commander, he can still make laws, but people don't hate him. They still have to kind of like have a warmth around him so that they can follow his lead.
And even with Ty, like, playing cards with them and whatever, which he probably shouldn't be doing, he's still, like, none of that matters once we're in our uniforms.
Yeah.
So then we execute jump number 238. And when they get to where they jump to, Dee realizes that there is a ship unaccounted for. This is the Olympic carrier. She doesn't know if she missed them in her checklist or if they jumped to the wrong place or if the Cylons got them before they were able to jump. There were over 1,300 people on the ship. No one is happy about this. I feel bad for Dee because, I mean, we don't know for sure, I guess. It's left ambiguous whether or not the Olympic carrier was the ship that was tracking them. Although I do think it's leaning more towards it was than it wasn't. So this isn't her fault, but she's so tired that she just can't remember if it checked in or not. And that's got to be a terrible feeling when you think 1,300 people just died because of Cylons because I didn't do my job well enough.
Right. Like, even if, and I do think she did her job, you know, and it wasn't her fault. But in that moment, yeah, like nobody knew at that point. So it kind of gets revealed a little bit more as they move along in time. But yeah, like, and even Gaeta, everyone was kind of dumbfounded. No one could really give any answers. And yeah,
well, Gaeta defended her.
Yeah. But it's like no one could really say for sure what happened. But it's
right.
I mean, in my head, it's because the Cylons like took them, you know. So it wasn't their fault.
So, do you think the Cylons had been tracking that ship this whole time, or it was just convenient that they captured one and then didn't jump to the coordinates for 3 hours?
I kind of feel like if I'm kind of going down the logic path, I kind of feel like maybe the pilot or the captain, somebody in that crew was a Cylon agent, and that was just kind of it. And because there were still other Cylons in the fleet that we'll see a little bit later, but none of them were really like. It's not like they all like had tracking chips or something in their bodies, right. But I think in this particular instance, it probably was like the captain or one of the flight crew. And I only say that because when we see the ship later, it's the captain's actually talking, and then but then all of a sudden like makes a beeline for the other ships. So logistically, that's just kind of what I think is happening, and then maybe was relaying that information to the Cylons. And so,
Well, the Olympic carrier disappearing is great news for Baltar because Dr. Emmerich was on that ship, and Head 6 tells him that God is looking out for him. He is not convinced. He says it's a coincidence. She does not like this at all, and basically says that whatever God gives, he can take away. The clock hits 33 minutes, and the Cylons don't appear. Adama changes them to level 2. I can't remember the phrase he used. But it's like allowing everybody to get some rest while they're sort of in a holding pattern. Like maybe the chase is over and we can relax. Let's take advantage of this, except for Apollo, Starbuck, and Boomer, who are all on stims, so they get to stay out and patrol. And then the Olympic carrier returns. They claim that they couldn't get their jump drive to work, and it took 3 hours to fix it. They also have a really lame excuse of, I don't know why the Cylons didn't attack us. They just left us alone. Which is suspicious. And Dr. Amarak is still adamant that he needs to speak with the president immediately. And this is where Baltar, like, rushes over to Rosalind and is like, no, they're Cylons. They were tracking that ship. And he's, like, freaking out. And then Adama's like, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, this was the scene that I thought was actually really brilliant because, again, it's like Baltar's motivation is like he immediately goes into that hysteric survival mode, right? But he actually was actually correct, and then watching, but like again, his motive was just clearly so that he doesn't quote unquote get in trouble. And but then Rosalind is actually kind of contemplating this seriously, and not necessarily picking up on his hysteria of wanting to survive, but more of like reading it as like he's pretty adamant that like we're in danger, which Adama pretty much picks up on that right away. Like, because he goes, like, he says action stations or whatever, right? He doesn't accept, like, this idea that they just came back. So he's pretty alert to the situation. Anyways, I like watching it. I just loved, like, how everybody's coming at it from a different place. And it's all taking place in that moment. It's really, again, I'm going to say this a billion times, but every scene is, like, kind of like a masterpiece.
They are told, Boomer is told to tell the ship to halt its movements towards the fleet or to stop coming towards the fleet. Everybody else is to get off of the networked communication so that the Cylons can't infiltrate. But the ship stops responding to her. And, well, I guess she had to go to no communication, so she sort of flashed a signal at them, but they ignore that and keep moving towards the fleet. Then Apollo opens communications and is trying to talk to them, and they won't answer him. Adama wants them to destroy the ship. Is it Crashdown notices some nuclear signatures or something?
On the I think they simultaneously, I might be misremembering, but a crashdown definitely gets a radiological alarm, and I think they might detect it on Galactica as well. The question initially is, where is it coming from? And then they're like, oh, it's actually from the Olympic carrier, and then that's when everything changes. That's when he decides that that they need to shoot the ship down.
Yeah. Like, why would a passenger vessel have nukes on it?
Mm-hmm.
So Apollo gets into position, and Starbuck is really against doing this. But when they get the okay, which they don't get until conveniently after Baltar is bullied into repenting.
Mm-hmm.
Apollo opens fire, and Starbuck follows his lead, and the ship blows up. And then the Cylons stop following them.
That scene was actually really interesting because of the... I just remember the first time I watched it. It's a very haunting shot of Apollo flying by the windows of the Olympic carrier just to see if there's anybody in there, and you see this like empty ship. But I do know, like through listening to the podcast years ago, they did have like the special effects person had like one of the windows actually show a hint of movement, just to kind of make it so that there's this question, you know.
On the Wikipedia page or from the Battlestar Wiki, there was a thing about originally written and shot that Apollo fires on the Olympic carrier, but it was made clear that he sees people inside. Ron Moore wrote the scene to be strong and clear that the characters were making the decision to fire on the passenger liner in full awareness of the consequences, and to illustrate and emphasize the uncompromising nature of the show. This was an enormous fight between Moore and the network, with the network feeling this was another scene that was too dark and had the potential to turn away audiences. The network further implied that if the scene were left intact, they may have been compelled to air the episode out of order. So, to placate the network, Moore and Ike changed the ending of the episode and cheated. Instead, when Apollo fires or flies by the Olympic carrier, it's unclear whether or not there's anybody inside.
Having said that, it's interesting. If I contemplate, I feel like the fight that the execs might have put on actually was a good one, because the vagueness of it is what we carry with us.
Yeah.
And it made it it made it more powerful in a different way than if it was like blatantly we saw. Like it just would have been a completely different experience, and who's to say what would actually happen. But like, and it was this lingering I don't know, and it kind of like it was around for a long time, you know. And I think the impact of that actually was maybe stronger story-wise than if they had just, you know, shown them actually having to destroy all those people, and it was like certain that there were people on the ship.
The way I always took it was there had been people on the ship. There had been 1,300 plus people. Mm-hmm. Now they're dead. Mm-hmm. Because the Cylons killed them, and that in itself is upsetting. That there were Cylons on the ship. Maybe there were multiple Cylons on the ship. Mm-hmm. You know, not just Centurions. Maybe they had Centurions sort of tucked away somewhere, or maybe it was just a whole lot of human models. Mm-hmm. I guess it couldn't be a whole lot because there's only so many of them. You can't have a bunch of twins walking around, but enough of them that they could kill everybody in those 3 hours.
Yeah.
Maybe the ship was mostly empty because everybody was dead on the ground instead of sitting in front of windows. Or maybe there were never 1,300 people on that ship and they just lied about their count.
Yeah, I mean, I took it to mean like what you said, the first version, that there were 1,300 people there, and then it didn't jump, and the Cylons took them. maybe started doing experiments on them or whatever, but they were no longer on the ship when it jumped back. But
oh yeah, that could be too. Is that there were 1,300 people on the ship? There was 1 or 2 Cylon agents that made it so that it didn't jump. Possibly, probably the pilot, and then the Cylons boarded the ship and Centurions just killed them all.
Yeah. Because we know we know that, you know, we see later they have saved some humans and for whatever they're trying to discover. So yeah, they definitely could have like whisked them away, killed some, who knows.
Well, that segues us nicely into on Caprica. There's not a whole lot to talk about because Hilo is basically just running and being pursued by Centurions. He kills a few, he blows a couple up, but then he is caught because he's distracted by a 6 in a white coat just standing in the woods, and then a Centurion comes up behind him, ties him up, and then she approaches him and asks if he's alive, and then kisses him because that's what she does at this point in the series. I'm glad that they kind of stopped that a little bit with having her just like be just so overtly sexual all the time. Because she's much more interesting when she's not.
Yeah.
As she's kissing him, though, she is shot. He's horrified because he doesn't know that they look like humans, so he just thinks this is a person who just got shot. And it is Sharon. And he's like, what are you doing here? I told you not to come back for me. And she's just like, can you walk? Let's go. And they take off together. And we see another 6 in a white coat watching them go away with a Centurion. I was going to act like we're not a spoiled show here. I'm sure we'll see them again. We will get more of Hilo and Sharon on the run story as we go on.
The sort of the interesting part for me about that, especially when the show, like, you know, it felt like it'd been a year since the miniseries. So, you know, we know the story of them kind of on the run, the fleet escaping, but then all of a sudden we have this scene with the guy. Oh, that's the guy that was in the miniseries. Oh, we're back on Caprica, and I kind of didn't know what was going on, and it added this element of not a game changer, but like a little bit of like. There was an intrigue around it, and it plays out over quite a bit of time. I think I talked about it in the last podcast, but part of the decision for that was motivated from the studio, like really liking Tamo, and so they. You know, brought him back, but it's like we bring him back. What do we do with him? And then they created this whole story arc. But you know, just knowing how it all plays out, and it takes over a season for it. But it's also like knowing that the fleet is leaving Caprica, but we keep coming back to Caprica, and it's just like, how is this going to connect? And it was really intriguing. It kind of made this mystery feeling. So it added a different element to the show that that made it more interesting than it already was. And it gave probably the writers a little bit of a break from having to do all of the scenes and storylines on Galactica to wipe them out, so they can always just go back to Caprica for a little bit and check out Hilo.
It was also because the execs at Sci-Fi were really concerned about this being just another Stargate or Star Trek or whatever kind of show. Yeah. And so part of the pitch to get this picked up to series was, well, we have Hilo still on Caprica, so we're going to be on a planet surface. And also we've got Baltar constantly retreating to his house in his head. So we'll have this beautiful scenery like on a lake. You know, so it sort of breaks up everything being on ships.
Yeah.
And that helped them sell the show.
It was a more grounded version than what was on the original series. They would go to other planets on the original series, but it was, those planets were often inhabited already with other people. There was I think in the first episode or second episode, they go to some bar, cantina in space. But that was
just
their,
like a reflection of Star Trek.
Yeah.
Because all we knew with space shows was it needs to be like what Star Trek did. You go to other planets and there's aliens.
Yeah, yeah. But it was like a different version of that. It was one of the things I really loved about the new series was the idea that there was life was on Caprica, and then that was it. There was once they got out there, space is vast, distant, and it's dark and it's cold, and life is precious, and it's really rare and hard to find out there. Mm-hmm. So literally trying to find Earth meant something. It wasn't just they could have stopped anywhere. And when they do make a decision to stop later, it's actually a hard life that they're kind of agreeing to for certain reasons. So,
in the first series, were there aliens, or was it all humans?
There were definitely they were mostly humans that we saw. The Cylons actually were originally lizard people or something. And when they went and then in that first movie, actually they showed it as a movie, and my parents actually took me to see it. But they were on this planet, and there's these alien women that are singing a disco song, and they had four eyes and 2 mouths or something. There's 3 or 4 of them. They got afros. Really cool. I think I sent you the that disco soundtrack, and that one of the tracks is So, but I don't. They don't. I can recall a couple of episodes where they're on a planet, but it's here's some farmer out here on his planet. There was a whole spiritual spaceship element of people that were aliens, but they all looked human. I can't recall outside of those disco singers of any other blatant non-human characters, though.
I remember Edward James Olmos saying that one of the stipulations for him for taking this job was the assurance that there would be no aliens in this show. Mm-hmm. That he was not going to do a sci-fi show with aliens. He's not doing it. It's not his bag. He didn't want it. Mm-hmm. And they were like, no, this is political and drama. This is a drama. It just happens to take place in space.
Yeah.
And I always appreciated that because it was hard for me to get into sci-fi. I had a weird bias against it because I thought everything was kind of like Star Trek, which I wasn't into. Mm-hmm. I'm a little into it now, but Star Trek has always been a little sanitized, I guess, for me. Mm-hmm. Everything just sort of wraps up at the end of every episode, and that's just not the kind of storytelling I've ever really been into.
It's actually really interesting that you say that, because that was sort of, again, Ron Moore's involvement in Deep Space Nine was changing that dynamic you're talking about. And it was one of the first times in Star Trek where they had any semblance long form storytelling, and season arcs and that stuff. Back then, it was early 90s. That was it was very rarely done. Yeah. The consequences of things that happened before, kind of carried over. And, that structure was there just out of necessity for them to be able to, before Deep Space Nine was just so that they could show episodes out of order. That was pretty much it. That's why everything wrapped up. But as TV started to progress, they wanted to, get into the more interesting element of changing that. And they did that pretty successfully on Deep Space Nine. His discord came when he was on Voyager, and he wanted to sort of continue that idea by following the premise, which is the ship is 70 years away from Earth. But the showrunners kept wrapping everything up as though nothing happened. So every episode was like a restart. And so he that's why Ron Moore left the show. And so he took basically what he thought Voyager should have been over into Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also left the show, I read this in that So Say We All book, because the showrunner on Voyager, he had worked with him on something else. Don't think it was Deep Space Nine, but he'd worked with him on something else. But in that situation, he was the boss, and this guy was below him. And now the tables were turned, and it sounds like Ron Moore had a lot of difficulty sort of changing the dynamic where he was subordinate. Not that he resented his friend for being his boss now, but because he just was so used to the dynamic that they'd had that he was incapable of being a number two.
I think a lot of the decisions that they made on the show would have contributed to that, because it's one thing if you're on the same page and you're subordinate, but I remember him just talking a lot about how there was just an inconsistency with and a not caring about they would destroy. I mean, he says it they destroyed a shuttlecraft in Voyager, and then the next episode they have the same number. It's stuff like that, and I can see how that that's if you're not in charge, but the person in charge is oh no big deal, whatever. I can see it. I can see how that would be an extra added twist in on top of not getting to make the call or something.
And the studio was no, we're not doing the serialized stuff. They wanted to be able to have it in syndication and just have whatever episode play.
Yeah.
So yeah, coming into Battlestar when I was already dipping my toe into sci-fi, because previously it was Star Wars and that was it. That was the only sci-fi I paid any attention to. When somebody, I think it was our friend Darnell, who was well, you watch Buffy, that's sci-fi. And I was no, it's not. And he's it's vampires, it's sci-fi.
Yeah.
And when I started to think about sci-fi as being more than just things that take place in space, and it opened up all of these areas of storytelling for me. And then, Battlestar comes along, and I watched that one episode and was holy shit, this is just a really good drama.
Yeah.
So I want to watch it. But what I love about it is it's a drama. It's a story about people. They just happen to be on a ship or a series of ships. It's just really spectacular. I have watched a bit ahead in season 1, and I'm just so excited about this show. I can't stop watching it. I love it so much.
It's actually funny for me because, sci-fi is always spaceship sci-fi has been from almost day one has been my favorite. Even before Star Wars, it's always been my favorite. And it's funny what you were saying, because you don't like the aliens, and it's right before Battlestar came on, I just discovered Farscape, and Farscape's they go deep down the rabbit hole of like exotic looking aliens and creatures.
Yeah, there's a reason I've always looked at that show and been like, nope.
Yeah,
not for me.
It's funny because it actually, I feel like it does what you like. You were saying like Star Trek felt sanitized, and I feel like Farscape actually like wiped away that sanitization, and it was like this like they doubled down on the costumes and the characters, and it was a little bit more like realistic's not the word, but like it would have been more organic for the world that they created. And the Star Trek just kind of had a more stately look. The aliens just had ridges on their noses.
Right.
Yeah. And anyways, I don't know. I just think it's funny because like I went from Farscape being like my all-time favorite to like almost immediately after Battlestar came on. They're like almost two completely different shows, but
yeah.
they served me well. I used to say Frel a lot. That was the swear in Farscape, and then pretty soon changed to Frack. So
Frack is much more fun.
yeah.
All right, so Ron Moore explained on his blog that the number 33 had no hidden meaning or significance, only that he felt it was sufficiently long enough to allow minor functions like snacking, showering, or catnapping, but was too short to allow anybody to gain any meaningful sleep and recharge their batteries. Mm-hmm. He intentionally gave the number no meaning to avoid creating and inserting unnecessary technobabble into a drama-driven episode. We talked about cutscenes. One of them, well, here's a little series of them. There was included a shot in the pilot's head showing the pilots wrecked and exhausted with an exchange between Starbuck and Apollo, as well as several shots of Commander Adama gagging and vomiting because of acid reflux brought on by sleep deprivation.
Jesus.
Yeah, glad they left that out.
What? I didn't even know that was a side of like what?
I don't know. Another scene that they left out was we see in this episode as they're leaving the ready room, they all sort of touch this photograph of a guy on his knees, and the explanation of that was inspired by the shot of firefighters raising the flag at Ground Zero, which was itself inspired by the soldiers raising the flag at Iwo Jima. It was a snapshot in the moment that became a symbol of the day they can never forget and that they had all lost. It's a picture of a soldier falling to his knees as he stands on the rooftop overlooking the devastation of his city, and it's supposed to be on Erelon. And the inscription, Rosalind was supposed to get a copy of this.
Okay.
And on the plaque, it says, "Lest we forget." I like that they just didn't give an explanation for it, because you can kind of understand what it means just by seeing it.
Yeah, I never knew all of that. I just always saw the picture and I understood what it was and what it meant. I didn't know the specifics. I didn't know it was on Erelon. It makes me actually kind of I'm in line with the sort of like racism they explore a little bit later in the show, because I always assumed it was Caprica. But yeah, it's like it's pretty self-evident. It's like it was like a character for me, and it just kind of just like the Remembrance Hall. It just seemed like something that people would do in that environment, and I didn't need a great explanation about it. And it's almost like it was a character of the show, or at least of the CAG Ready Room, or whatever you call it. So,
and it's during the first Cylon War.
Yeah.
And what I like about sort of learning this and then seeing, because they don't do that in the first episode when they're like running out of the ready room and everything. You don't see them doing that. They do it now because now suddenly now we're at war. We haven't been at war for 40 years, and now we're at war, and here's a picture from the first one.
Yeah, and they slap it, right? There's like that.
Yeah,
there's that element of like good luck.
Yeah, everybody does sort of a different thing, but
Yeah.
it reminds me of Friday Night Lights and Ted Lasso. In Friday Night Lights, it's I don't remember what their sign says. If it was clear eyes, full hearts.
Clear eyes, full hearts can't lose. I'm actually in the middle of watching that right now. That's my second favorite show behind Battlestar Galactica.
God, it's a perfect show except for that whole chunk
except
of
for
season 2.
Yeah, season 2, yeah. Except for season 2. Like some people I'm like, oh yeah, just maybe just skip past that one. There's a writer strike and whatever. Yeah.
Another little bit of trivia is that there was an ad-libbed line from Edward James Olmos about suicides in the fleet, but it was cut to not alienate audiences by being too dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the one I mentioned a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
And it's they do visit that topic much, much later. But it is a bit dark.
And then they wrote in the additional scene at the end where Rosalind learns that there was a baby born on the rising star, which is a nice little scene. They wanted to end it with a little bit of hope.
That was a last minute one, because that seemed like it was the whole thrust of the episode, actually. I
mean, good writing will find a way to make that kind of suggestion work, but they'd been... it was supposed to end with Hilo's escape from the Cylons on Caprica, and the episode, or the network kept saying that the episode was too dark. Mm-hmm. So they added this baby being born, which is exactly how it should end from, when we're looking at like 3,300 or 1,300 people just died.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the thing about this show for me was, as dark as it got, there was always like these little glimmers of hope and that idea that it's worth continuing to fight for, to exist. And it's also kind of answering that speech that Adama says in the miniseries about, are we worth being alive or whatever, paraphrasing what he said.
Yeah.
But yeah, those little moments are the ones that you go, oh yeah, that's right. And it calls back to that line that he said, that Rosalind said in the miniseries, we need to start having babies. So there's something on the other side of this if we just stick it out.
Yeah, I think sometimes you've got a writer who goes real hard on, like, here's my vision. And it is unlike anything you've ever seen on television before. And oftentimes, network executives are a nuisance, and they don't know what they're talking about. And other times, that input is needed. Because I think you're a writer, so I would assume you kind of feel this way, like, sometimes you're just too close to something. And you need somebody to be like, okay, this is great, but a bummer.
Yeah,
So,
it's never fun getting notes, actually.
well, sure.
Because you're just like, why don't you get it? Or like, what's the big deal? Like, and I think those are the fights that I think they fought a lot. But it's true because, it's always good to have a different perspective. Like, you can be so dialed in that you can't see, can't see the forest for the trees kind of deal. And in this case, it like kept them honest, like, yeah. Like we do need to have them have a reason to actually want to be alive. And, it's actually interesting. One of the things I had been thinking about, rewatching this show over the last few years was, again, in the context of the pandemic, how I'd always thought about when watching the show that we only really see the military, and we never really see the effect that it had on the civilians being cramped on these ships. And and I, having experienced the last 3 years, I was kind of like, the effects of their situation kind of felt even more real to me, And yeah, another reason why this show, I think, is just like like so many things happen in the real world that can inform the show, whether it was 9/11, Iraq War, now the pandemic,
stuff we didn't even see coming, like the pandemic.
Yeah, and it's just because it's not that it's necessarily trying to predict anything, but it's actually, I think it just reflects back on the nature of humanity, and so we kind of go through the same things and all the time, so it's just very authentic in that way. So,
well, who would have thought that there would be a time in our lives where we were told to not leave our houses? Mm-hmm. And some people handled that well. I mean, I want to say I did, as far as not being able to go anywhere. I was cool with that. Mm-hmm. Like, partially because I was scared, but also because I'm a Gen Xer. I spent a lot of time by myself as a teenager. I've always been really cool with just hanging out at home and watching TV. Like, I have to sit at home for 8 weeks and watch TV. Okay. Yeah. I was fine with that. But I know I'm also introverted, and so that also made it easier for me to stay home. I have friends who struggled really badly with the not being able to be social aspect, the not being able to leave your house aspect, like just being that cabin fever. Yeah. And it would have been interesting if we'd seen a little more of that on this show, because I would imagine, especially the people who are like, I'm just traveling from one place to the next, and oh shit, now all of our homes are destroyed. Now I'm stuck on this ship. And you literally can never leave the ship except to maybe get shuttled over to a different ship. Yeah. It's, to have explored what that would do to someone's psyche would have been interesting.
Again, they do touch on it here and there, sometimes a lot bit later, but in this first season, I know they touch on it a little bit when they're in the, I think it's Colonial Days, the episode. And then I think it's in the second season, just talking about, again, I think it's authentic to human experience, where not everybody was on board with what the military was saying, and there were people that were coming up with their own version of conspiracy theories, and they were taking action based on that. So I just, again, the stuff that we were seeing, how people were acting in these last few years, to me was pretty on brand with humanity. I wasn't really surprised with a lot of stuff. Not everybody's always going to agree, but this show is very in tune with how a group of people will react to extreme circumstances.
All right, so let's go through our categories. Was Baltar the worst this week?
Yeah, he probably was.
I felt like he was not the worst, but he was definitely annoying. It's not his fault, though. I'll give him a pass. He was very tired. And he's dealing with this strange sensation of having his dead robot girlfriend in his head. So, for now, I'm giving him a little bit of grace. Who would you throw out the airlock?
So I had this. This is gonna be an unpopular answer, but for the first season, I found Starbuck pretty grating, almost always. So
what's funny is my boyfriend said the same thing yesterday.
Yeah, and so that whole scene with her and Lee, I just was like, yeah, I could have done without it. There's not. It's just the way she's abrasive. It's the acting. It was like all this stuff, and she would drive me nuts, And so I would, I'll bet at the same time I liked her. So it wasn't, so it was a strange thing, but probably because she challenged my idea of femininity. Actually, now that I think about it, yeah, like. There was a scene and a few episodes down the road where she shows up in a dress, and I remember going, "Oh, yeah." So then then I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm just a pig," and she's not fitting into what I think she needs to be, and that's probably why I was so rough on her. But anyway, having said all that, I still would throw her out the airlock.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have anyone really that really got on my nerves in this episode. So for me, they're safe. Everyone's safe from the airlock this week.
Real quick, you know what it was? When they said to shoot a warning shot across the bow of the Olympic carrier, she started laughing when she did it. That's what drove me nuts. Like,
did she?
Yeah, she kind of was like, haha, because she was playing like I'm on stims, and I'm like, she was playing it like she was drunk rather than like, this was like a tired, weary, serious situation.
Yeah.
She did that a lot. So,
did you have a favorite Cylon this week?
I mean, when Athena shows up. As opposed to Boomer, like when Athena shows up, like she will always be my number 4.
Let's go, mister.
Yeah. We gotta move.
For me, it's the number 8. I can't really pick between Boomer and Athena. I like them both at this point, so Sharon's my favorite of the Sharons.
Yeah.
I don't have a frack count. I was thinking of trying to keep track of all the fracks, and I just don't think that's possible, so I'll probably delete that. Who do you think got full colors? Who's the best this week?
The best
character. Yeah.
I'm going to go with it's a toss-up. So I'm going to go between Colonel Ty and Rosalind.
Okay.
Yeah. For completely different reasons.
What are your reasons?
Ty was sort of playing to his character and like exactly who he needed to be. He's sort of like this, the kind of the ball breaker. And I probably am cheating a little bit because like I kind of know where he, kind of where he ends up, especially at the beginning of season 2. But then Rosalind, like the whole thing about her is like she's the nurturer to the fleet, the nurturer, and I like her calming presence or her in control presence in all the scenes. She kind of grounds everything from the intensity, So there's a scene when Adama has to, he's like, get me the president, and they have that interaction. Like I really loved it because it was so distant. And I loved how they were playing these official roles, and they kind of like, especially like Adama didn't really want to deal with her, but he was just kind of like playing to it because he's he had to. But the way that Rosalind plays the role is like she's like, no, we really are doing something, and you're going to follow this, and I know what I'm talking about. Like I love that dynamic in the early days, anyways, and I love how it obviously how it shifts. So
there was several times in this episode where he's like, "This is a military decision," and she's like, Yeah, I get that. I'm just asking questions.
Yeah.
I'm
he says that a
deferring
lot.
to you in this.
in the
Yes,
first
he does.
season, he says that
But
a lot.
I think because he doesn't respect her and he doesn't truly respect her authority
Yeah.
early on. And so it's almost like he's trying to justify his actions by, it's a military decision. And she's like, yeah, I didn't have any issue with that. I'm just, deferring to you on this, just asking the question.
Yeah.
I would say for me, it's Rosalind. I just, in a crazy situation that she's never expected to be in, she does this whole thing where she's just like, okay, next crisis. And I just kind of like that about her, where she's just like, everything is really stressful and a lot to handle, but what's the next thing on our docket? Let's just get through one thing at a time. I will give Ty credit for allowing Adama to get a 10-minute nap. And when Dee says, I'm pretty sure it was your turn, he's like, he didn't remember that he hasn't taken a nap. He needs a nap. I just like that he's looking out for Adama and sacrificing a little bit of rest for himself.
One of my last notes about Ty was that he, when they were talking about, you mentioned earlier when he's like, I've never felt more alive. I feel good. I was like, yeah, because he hasn't been able to have a drink for 5 days. So
well, he's got his bottle.
It's like, was he like detoxing or something? That's why he feels good.
Well, yeah. For these 5 days, he probably hasn't been able to have a drink because there's no time to like stop. Can't be sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
All right. So next week we have water. So a lot of sleeper agent boomer stuff.
Yeah, it's gonna be.
Any pre-thoughts?
Yeah, I just this was this first 5 or 6 episodes obviously laid the groundwork, I think, for where the show is going to head. But one of the important part for this second episode was just that it was dealing with like the practical side of what the situation they were faced with, which is like we need water. We don't think about water a lot in our world because we just turn on the faucet and it just appears, but it's like it comes from somewhere and it has to do something, and they had to deal with that. And again, thinking over back to Voyager, that was stuff that they just never like really dealt with, So and it on top of the Cylons, it was like they just had to deal with this. I think there's a issue with food down the road. So it's all, all good stuff.
Yep. Agreed. All right, then. Until next time, what do you hear?
Nothing but the rain.
Bye.
Bye.